invite anyone within earshot to come take a seat. If there's anyone outside. In just a second, I'm going to invite up Austin Young, who is going to be the first MC for the evening. He's going to deliver a brief welcome speech that in and of itself will be worthy of recitation in about 2 generations. All right. So thank you all for coming. Austin, why don't you come on up?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our celebration of the spoken word. Tonight, we gather to appreciate the timeless beauty and power of poetry and classic speeches. As the great English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge once said, "Poetry is the best words in the best order." And we are here tonight to revel in that perfect order. Now, I know what you might be thinking. An evening of poetry and speeches, how thrilling. But fear not. My dear audience, we have a few tricks up our sleeves to make sure you're thoroughly charmed and entertained. And no, I'm not talking about a poetry slam where we pit poets against each other in a battle to the death. Although that could be interesting. No matter. Instead, we've assembled a group of talented performers who will be reciting works from some of the greatest poets and orators of all time. From Tolkien to C.S. Lewis, from Bradbury to Dostoevsky, we've got it all. And if that's not enough to impress you, we've also served some delicious refreshments to keep you fueled and energized throughout the evening. So, just think of us as your literary bartenders, serving up sonnets and speeches instead of martinis and mojitos. So, sit back, relax, and let the words wash over you. And who knows, maybe by the end of the night, you'll be inspired to pen your own masterpiece. Or at the very least, you'll have a newfound appreciation for the power of language. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
Rage. Sing, goddess, Achilles' rage, black and murderous, that cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched countless souls of heroes into Hades dark, and left their bodies to rot as feasts for dogs and birds. As Zeus's will was done. Begin with the clash between Agamemnon and Achilles. Begin with the clash between Agamemnon, the Greek warlord, and godlike Achilles. Which of the immortals set these two at each other's throats? Apollo, Zeus's son, and Leto's offended by the warlord. Agamemnon had dishonored Chryseis, Apollo's priest. So the gods struck the Greek camp with the plague, and the soldiers were dying of it. Chryseis had come to the Greek camp with the fortune for his daughter's ransom. Displaying Apollo's sacral ribbons, he made a formal plea to the entire Greek army, but especially to the two commanders, Atreus' two sons. Sons of Atreus and Greek heroes all, may the gods on Olympus grant you plunder of Priam's city and a safe return home. But give me back my daughter and accept this ransom out of respect for Zeus' son, Lord Apollo, who deals death from afar. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Respect the priest and take the ransom. But Agamemnon was not pleased and dismissed Chryseis with rough speech. Don't let me ever catch you here, old man, by these ships again, skulking around now or sneaking back later. The god's staff and ribbons won't protect you next time. The girl is mine, and she'll be an old woman in Argos before I let her go. Working the loom in my house and coming to my bed, far from her home. And now clear out of here before you make me angry. The old man was afraid and did as he was told. He walked in silence along the whispering surf line, and when he had gone some distance, he prayed to Lord Apollo, son of silken-haired Leto. Hear me, Silverbow, protector of Sisu, Lord of Holy Celia, and Master of Tenedos, and the Smithian god of plague. If ever I have built you a temple that pleased you, or burnt fat thigh bones of bulls and goats, grant me this wish. Let the Dianians pay for my tears with your arrows. Apollo heard this prayer and descended Olympus's crags, pulsing with fury, bow strung over one shoulder, the arrows rattling in their case, as the angry god moved like night down the mountain.
Footprints in the sand. One night I dreamed a dream as I was walking along the shore with my Lord. Across the dark sky flashed scenes from my life. For each scene, I noticed two sets of footprints in the sand, one belonging to me and one to my Lord. After the last scene of my life flashed before me, I looked back at the footprints in the sand. I noticed that at many times along the path of my life, especially at the very saddest and most troublesome times, there was only one set of footprints. This really troubled me, so I asked the Lord about it. Lord, you said once I decided to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way. But I noticed that at the saddest and most troublesome times, there was only one set of footprints. I don't understand why, when I needed you the most, you would leave me. He whispered, "My precious child, I love you and will never leave you, never ever during your trials and testings. When you saw only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you." These next three recitations are all excerpts from C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, in which Uncle Screwtape gives advice to Wormwood, a young demon, in how to entice young Christian souls away from God. My dear Wormwood, so, you have great hopes that the patient's religious phase is dying away, have you? I always thought the training college had gone to pieces since they put old Slubgob at the head of it, and now I am sure. Has no one ever told you about the law of undulation? Humans are amphibians, half spirit and half animal. The enemy's determination to produce such a revolting hybrid was one of the things that determined our father to withdraw his support from him. As spirits, they belong to the eternal world, but as animals, they inhabit time. This means that while their spirits can be directed to an eternal object, their bodies, passions, and imaginations are in continual change, for to be in time means to change. Their nearest approach to constancy, therefore, is undulation, the repeated return to a level from which they repeatedly fall back, a series of troughs and peaks. If you had watched your patient carefully, you would have seen this undulation in every department of his life. His interest in his work, his affection for his friends, his physical appetites all go up and down. As long as he lives on this earth, periods of emotional and bodily richness and liveliness will alternate with periods of numbness and poverty. The dryness and dullness through which your patient is now going are not, as you fondly suppose, your workmanship. They are merely a natural phenomenon which will do us no good unless you make a good use of it. To decide what the best use of it is, you must ask what use the enemy wants to make of it, and then do the opposite. To decide what the best use of it is, you must ask the enemy. Now, it may surprise you that in his efforts to get permanent possession of a soul, he relies on the troughs even more than on the peaks. Some of his special favorites have gone through deeper and longer troughs than anyone else. The reason is this. To us, a human is primarily food. Our aim is the absorption of its will into ours, the increase of our own area of selfhood at its expense. But the obedience which the enemy demands of men is quite a different thing. One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, creatures whose life, on its miniature scale, will be qualitatively like his own. We want creatures who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in. He wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below has drawn all other beings into himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings, united to him, but still distinct.
And that is where the troughs come in. You must have often wondered, why does the enemy not make more use of his power to be sensibly present to any human soul he wants, at any degree and at any time he chooses? But now you understand that the irresistible and the indisputable are the two weapons which his very scheme forbids him to use. To merely override a human soul would be for him useless. He cannot ravish, he can only woo, for his ignoble idea is to eat the cake and have it. The creatures are to be one with him, but yet amongst themselves, to cancel or assimilate would be worthless. He is ready to do a little overriding at the start. He will set them communication of his presence, which though faint, seems great to them, with easy conquest over sin. The human will carry out wills from its duties, which have lost all relish. That is why it is much more during the trough periods than the peak periods in which the creature grows into what he wants it to become. The prayers stated in times of dryness are those which please him best. To drag out the patient with temptation, because we design it to only fit the table. And the more we interfere with the patient's will, the better. He wants the patient to learn to walk, and therefore he must take away his hand. And if the will to walk is really there, then he is pleased with its stumbles.
My dear Wormwood, obviously you are making excellent progress. My only fear, unless an attempt to hurry the patient, you awaken him to a sense of his real position. This is why I'm most glad he is still a churchgoer. There are real dangers in this, but as long as he retains a few habits from his Christian life, he will think that he has just made a few new friends, and he will have made no change from the way he was 6 weeks ago. You'll find that anything or nothing is sufficient to attract his attention. You no longer need a good book he really enjoys. Yesterday's paper will do. He no longer enjoys conversation. You can make him waste time with good conversation and conversation that he cares nothing for, and with subjects that bore him. You can keep him up late at night, staring at a dead fire in a cold room. As one of my own patients said on his arrival, I now see I spent more of my time doing not what I ought, nor what I enjoyed. Nothing is a very strong force, strong enough to steal away a man's best years, not in sweet sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their commutative effort is to push them away from the light and into the nothing. The most dangerous road to hell is the soft, gentle slope. No sudden turnings and no signposts.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be upon his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is generally considered to be the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. dear Mr. Bennet, do you not want to know who has taken it? Cried his wife impatiently. You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it. This was invitation enough. Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of good fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls. How so? How can it affect them? My dear Mr. Bennet, how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? Design? Nonsense! How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps may be still better. For as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley may like you the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of such things. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it will be for them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go merely on that account, for you know in general they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. You are over-scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent of his marrying whichever he chooses of my daughters. Though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. I desire that you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, for I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humored as Lydia. But you are always giving her the preference. They have none of them much to recommend them. They're all silly and ignorant like other girls. But Lizzie has something more of quickness about her than the others. Mr. Bennet! How can you abuse your own daughters in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no consideration for my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high regard for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these last 20 years, at least. Ah, you do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient for his wife to understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news.
In the part of Anne of Green Gables I'm reciting, Anne and her friends are pretending to perform a play written by Tennyson, and Anne is playing the part of Elaine. For a few minutes, Anne, drifting slowly down, enjoyed the romance of her situation to the full. Then something happened not at all romantic. The flat began to leak. In a very few moments, it was necessary for Elaine to scramble to her feet, pick up her cloth of gold coverlet and paw of blackest smite, and gaze blankly at a big crack at the bottom of her barge, through which the water was literally pouring. That sharp stake at the landing had torn the strip of batting nailed on the flat. Anne did not know this, but it did not take her long to realize that she was in a dangerous plight. At this rate, the flat would fill and sink long before it could drift to the lower headland. Where were the oars? Left behind at the landing. Anne gave a gasping little scream, which no one ever heard. She was white to the lips, but she did not lose her self-possession. There was one chance, just one. I was horribly frightened, she told Mrs. Allen the next day, and it seemed like years while the flat was drifting down the bridge, the water rising in it every moment. I prayed, Mrs. Allen, most earnestly, but I didn't shut my eyes to pray, for I knew the only way that God could hear me. For I knew the only way that I didn't shut my eyes to pray, for I knew the only way that God could save me was to let the flat float close enough to one of the bridge piles for me to climb up on it. You know, the piles are just old tree trunks, and there are lots of knots and old branch stubs on them. It was proper to pray, but I had to do my part by watching out, and right well I knew it. I just said, "Dear God, please let the flat float close enough to one of the piles, and I'll do the rest," over and over again. Under such circumstances, you don't think much about making a flowery prayer. But mine was answered, for the flat bumped right into a pile for a minute, and I flung the scarf and shawl over my shoulder and climbed up on a big providential stub. And there I was, Mrs. Allen, clinging to that slippery old pile, with no way of getting up or down. It was a very unromantic position, but I didn't think about that at the time. You don't think much about romance when you have just escaped from a watery grave. I said a grateful prayer at once, and then I gave all my attention to holding on tight, for I knew I should probably have to depend on human aid to get back to dry land. The flat drifted under the bridge and then promptly sank in midstream. Ruby, Jane, and Diana, already awaiting it on the lower headland, saw the flat disappear before their very eyes, and had not a doubt but that Anne had gone down with it. For a moment they stood still, white as sheets, frozen with horror at the tragedy. Then, shrieking at the tops of their voices, they started on a frantic run up through the woods, never pausing as they crossed the main road to glance the way of the bridge. Anne, clinging desperately to her precarious foothold, saw their flying forms and heard their shrieks. Help would soon come, but meanwhile her position was a very uncomfortable one. The minutes passed by, each seeming an hour to the unfortunate Lily Maid. Why didn't someone come? Where had all the girls gone? Suppose they had fainted, one and all. Suppose no one ever came. Suppose she grew so cramped and tired she could hold on no longer. Anne looked at the wicked green depths below her, wavering with long, oily shadows, and shivered. Help would soon come, but meanwhile her position was a very uncomfortable one. Then, just as she thought she really could not endure the ache in her arms and wrists another moment, Gilbert Blythe came rowing under the bridge in Andrew's dory. Gilbert glanced up and, much to his surprise, beheld a little white, scornful face, looking down upon him with big, frightened, but also scornful gray eyes. "Anne Shirley, how on earth did you get there?" he exclaimed. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled close to the dory and pulled close to the pile and extended his hand. There was no help for it. Anne, clinging to Gilbert Blythe's hand, scrambled into the dory, where she sat, drabbled and furious, in the stern, with her arms full of dripping shawl and wet crepe. It was certainly extremely difficult to be dignified under the circumstances.
My recitation is from Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, in which Corrie and her sister Betsy are persecuted for their faith in God and sent to an internment camp. Morning call at Ravensbrook came half an hour earlier than at Vaught. By 4:30 a.m. we had to be standing outside in the black pre-dawn chill, standing at parade attention in blocks of 100 women, 10 wide, 10 deep. Barracks 8 was in the quarantine compound. Next to us, perhaps as a deliberate warning to newcomers, were located the punishment barracks. From there, all day long and often into the night, came the sounds of hell itself. These are not the sounds of anger or of any human emotion, but of a cruelty altogether detached, blows landing in regular rhythm, screams keeping pace. We would stand in our 10 deep ranks with our hands trembling against our sides, longing to jam them against our ears, to make the sounds stop. The instant of dismissal, we would mob the doors of Barracks 8, stepping on each other's heels in our eagerness to get inside, to shrink the world back to understandable proportions. It grew harder and harder. Even within these 4 walls, there was too much misery, too much seemingly pointless suffering. Every day, something else failed to make sense. Something else grew too heavy. Will you carry this too, Lord Jesus? But as the rest of the world grew stranger, one thing became increasingly clear, and that was the reason the 2 of us were here. Why others should suffer, we were not shown. As for us, from morning until lights out, when we were not in ranks for roll call, our Bible was the center of an ever-widening circle of help and hope. Like waifs clustered around a blazing fire, we gathered about it, holding out our hearts to its warmth and light. The blacker the night around us grew, the brighter and truer and more beautiful burned the word of God. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. I would look about us as Betsy read, watching the light leap from face to face. More than conquerors. It was not a wish, it was a fact. We knew it, we experienced it minute by minute. Poor, hated, hungry. We are more than conquerors. Not we shall be, we are. Life in Ravensbrook took place on 2 separate levels, mutually impossible. One, the observable, external life, grew every day more horrible. The other, the life we lived with God, grew daily better. Truth upon truth, glory upon glory. Sometimes I would slip the Bible from its little sack with hands that shook, so mysterious had it become to me. It was new. It had just been written. I marveled sometimes that the ink was dry. I had believed the Bible always, but reading it now had nothing to do with belief. It was simply a description of the way things were, of hell and heaven, of how men act and how God acts. I had heard 1,000 times the story of Jesus' arrest, how soldiers had slapped him, laughed at him, flogged him. Now such happenings had faces and voices.
I'll be reciting a piece from a book called The Heavenly Man. It's about a Christian who lives in China. This part is how he and his family came to faith. I was called to follow the Lord at the age of 16. The year was 1974, and the Cultural Revolution was still raging throughout China. At that time, my father was sick. He suffered from a severe type of asthma, which soon developed into lung cancer. The cancer soon spread to his stomach. The doctor told him that he would not be cured and would soon die. My mother was told, "There is no hope for your husband. Go home and prepare for his death." Every night, my father lay in bed, hardly able to breathe. Being a very superstitious man, he asked some neighbors to fetch a local Taoist priest to come and cast the demons out of him, as he believed his sickness was the result of upsetting a demon. My father's sickness sapped all our time, money, and possessions. Because of our poverty, I wasn't able to attend school until the age of 9, but then I had to drop out at 16 due to my father's cancer. My mother didn't know what she would do if my father died. She was faced with the daunting prospect of raising 5 children alone. We hoped my father would get better, but his condition worsened. Things were so bad that my mother even contemplated suicide. One night, she lay in bed, barely awake, and suddenly she heard a very loud, compassionate, and tender voice say to her, "Jesus loves you." She immediately knelt down on the ground and tearfully repented of all her sins and rededicated herself to the Lord Jesus Christ. She immediately called me and my siblings to come and dedicate ourselves to God as well. She said, "Jesus is the only hope for Father." So we all did after we heard what had happened. And for the rest of the night, we prayed a simple prayer over Father. Jesus, heal Father. Jesus, heal Father. The very next morning, my father was better. For the first time in months, he had an appetite for food, and within a week, he had no trace of the cancer. We experienced a great miracle from God, so much so that that all 5 of my siblings still follow God to this day. My mother was so grateful to God that what Father did, that she immediately wanted to tell all our family and friends and neighbors. Unfortunately, it was illegal to hold any meetings or public gatherings, but my parents came up with a plan. The fire of the gospel started to burn that day. Not only did it burn to the west, but also to the south. God opened many hearts to hear his word, and he enabled me to lead more than 2,000 people to God in my first year as a Christian.
What they saw, eastward beyond the sun, was a range of mountains. It was so high that either they never saw the top of it, or they forgot it. None of them remembers seeing any sky in that direction. And the mountains must really have been that tall. For mountains even 1/4 of a 20th of that height ought to have had ice and snow on them. But these were warm and green, and full of forest and waterfalls, however high you looked. And suddenly there came a breeze from the east, tossing the top of the wave into foamy shapes and ruffling the smooth water all around them. It lasted only a second or so, but what it brought them in that second, none of those 3 children will ever forget. Edmund and Eustace would never talk about it afterward. Lucy could only say, "It would break your heart." "Why?" said I. "Was it so sad?" "Sad? No," said Lucy. No one in that boat doubted that they were seeing beyond the end of the world, into Aslan's country. At that moment, with a crunch, the boat ran aground. The water was too shallow now for it. "This," said Reepicheep, "is where I go alone." They did not even try to stop him, for everything now felt as if it had been fated, or had happened before. They had helped him to lower his little coracle. Then, taking off his sword, he said, "I shall need it no more," and threw it far away across the lilied sea. Where it fell, it stood upright, with the hilt above the surface. Then he turned and bade them goodbye, trying to be sad for their sakes, but he was quivering with happiness. Lucy, for the first and last time, did what she had always wanted to do, taking him in her arms and caressing him. Then hastily, he got into his coracle and took his paddle, and the current caught it, and away he went, very black against the lilies. But no lilies grew in that wave. It was a smooth green slope. The coracle went more and more quickly, and beautifully it rushed up the wave's side. For one split second, they saw its shape and Reepicheep's on very top. Then it vanished. And since that moment, no one can truly claim to have seen Reepicheep the mouse. But my belief is that he came safe to Aslan's country and is alive there to this day. As the sun rose, the sight of those mountains outside the world faded away. The wave remained, but there was only blue sky behind it. The children got out of the boat and waded, not toward the wave, but southward, with the wall of water on their left. At last, they were on dry sand, and then on grass. A huge plain, a very fine short grass, almost level with the silver sea, and spreading out in every direction without so much as a molehill. Sun, and of course, as it always does, in a perfectly flat place without any trees, it looked as if the sky came down to meet the grass right in front of them. But between them and the foot of the sky, there was something so white on the green grass that even with their eagle's eyes, they could hardly look at it. They came on and saw that it was a lamb. "Come and have breakfast," said the lamb in its sweet, milky voice. They then noticed for the first time that there was a fire lit on the grass and fish roasting on it. They sat down and ate the fish, hungry now for the first time in many days. "Please, lamb," said Lucy, "is this the way to Aslan's country?" "Not for you," said the lamb. "For you, the door into Aslan's country lies in your own world." "What?" said Edmund. "Is there a way into Aslan's country from our world, too?" "There is a way into my country from all the worlds," said the lamb. But as he spoke, his snowy white flushed into tawny gold, and his size changed, and he was Aslan himself, standing before them, scattering light from his mane. "Oh, Aslan," said Lucy, "will you tell us how to get into your country from our world?" "I shall be telling you all the time," said Aslan, "but I will not tell you how long or short the way will be, only that it lies across a river. But do not fear that, for I am the great bridge builder. And now come, I will open the door in the sky." "Please, Aslan," said Lucy, "before we go, will you tell us when we can come back to Narnia again? Please? And oh, do make it soon." "Dearest," said Aslan, very gently, "you and your brother will never come back to Narnia." "No," said Edmund and Lucy both together in despairing voices. "You are too old, children," said Aslan, "and you must begin to come close to your own world now." "But it isn't Narnia, you know," sobbed Lucy. "It's you. We shan't meet you there. And how can we live never meeting you?" "But you shall meet me there, dear one," said Aslan. Are you there too, sir?" said Edmund. "I am," said Aslan. "But there I am known by another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason you were brought into Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there." "And is Eustace never to come back either?" said Lucy. "Child," said Aslan, "do you really need to know that? Come, I will open the door in the sky." Then, all in one moment, there was a rending of the blue wall, like a curtain being torn, and a terrible white light from beyond the sky, and the touch of Aslan's mane and the feel of a lion's kiss on their foreheads, and then the back bedroom and Aunt Alberta's home in Cambridge.
I will be reciting a piece from The Hobbit, Chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark. Gollum was disappointed once more. Now he was getting angry and also tired of the game. It had made him very hungry indeed. This time he did not go back to his boat, but he sat down in the dark next to Bilbo. That made the Hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits.
"It's got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, yes. Just one more question to guess. Yes, yes."
But Bilbo simply could not think of a question with that nasty, wet, cold thing sitting next to him and pawing and poking him. He pinched himself and scratched himself. Still, he could not think of anything.
"Ask us! Ask us!"
Bilbo pinched himself and slapped himself. He gripped on his little sword. He even felt in his pocket with his other hand. There he found the ring he had picked up in the passage and forgotten about. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said aloud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle and was frightfully upset.
Not fair, my precious. It isn't fair, is it, to ask us what it's got in its nasty little pockets is?
Bilbo, seeing what had happened and having nothing better to ask, stuck to his question. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said again, louder this time.
Hissed Gollum. It must give us 3 guesses, my precious. 3 guesses.
"Very well," said Bilbo. "Guess away."
"Hanses,"
said Gollum. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had luckily just taken his out again. "Guess again." Hissed Gollum, more upset than ever. He tried to think of all the things he kept in his own pockets. Fish bones, goblin's teeth, a bit of a wet shell, a bit of a bat's wing, a sharp stone to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think what other people kept in their pockets.
"Knife,"
he said at last. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had lost his some time ago. "Last guess." Now Gollum was in much worse state than when Bilbo had asked him the egg question. He hissed and spluttered and rocked himself backwards and forwards and wiggled and squirmed, yet still he did not dare waste his last guess. "Come on," said Bilbo. "I'm waiting." He tried to sound bold and cheerful, but he was not at all sure how the game was going to end, whether Gollum guessed right or not. "Time's up," he said at last.
"String or nothing!"
shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair, working in 2 guesses at once. "Both wrong," cried Bilbo, and he jumped at once to his feet, put his back to the nearest wall, and held out his little sword. He knew, of course, that the riddle game was sacred and of immense antiquity, and that even wicked creatures were scared to cheat when they played at it. But he felt he could not trust this nasty creature to keep any promise at a pinch. Any excuse would do for him to slip out of it. And after all, that last question had not been a genuine riddle according to the ancient laws. But, at any rate, Gollum did not at once attack. He could see the sword in Bilbo's hand, and he sat there, shivering and whispering. At last, Bilbo could stand it no longer. "What about your promise?" he said. "I want to go, and you must show me the way."
"Did we say so, precious? Show the nasty little Baggins is the way out?" "Yes, yes, but what's it got in its pockets is, eh? Not string, precious, but not nothing."
"Oh, no, Gollum." "Never you mind," said Bilbo. "A promise is a promise."
"Cross it is, impatient, precious. But we mustn't go up the passages so hasty. We must go and get some things first. Yes, yes, things to help us."
"Well, hurry up," said Bilbo, relieved to think of Gollum going away. Well, he thought he was just making some excuse and did not mean to come back. What was he talking about? What useful thing could he keep out on the dark lake? But he was wrong. Gollum did mean to come back. He was a miserable, wicked creature, and already he had a plan. Not far away was his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, and there in his hiding place he kept a few wretched oddments and one very beautiful thing. Very beautiful, very wonderful. He had a ring, a golden ring, a precious ring.
"My birthday present,"
he whispered to himself, as he had often done in the endless dark days.
"That's what we wants now. Yes, we wants it."
I will be reciting from Fahrenheit 451. The protagonist of Fahrenheit 451, Montag, lives in a dystopian society where he burns houses for a living. In the following scene, he has just been chased through the city by a cold killing machine called the Hound for breaking a fundamental law. He was 300 yards downstream when the Hound reached the river. Overhead, the great racketing fans of the helicopters hovered. A storm of light fell upon the river, and Montag dived under the great illumination as if the sun had broken the clouds. He felt the river pull him further on its way, into darkness. Then the light switched back to the land. The helicopters swerved over the city again, as if they had picked up another trail. They were gone. The hound was gone. Now there was only the cold river and Montag, floating in a sudden peacefulness, away from the city and the lights and the chase, away from everything. He felt as if he had left a stage behind and many actors. He felt as if he had left the great seance and all the murmuring ghosts. He was moving from an unreality that was frightening into a reality that was unreal because it was new. The black land slid by, and Montag was going into the country among the hills. For the first time in a dozen years, the stars were coming out above him in great processions of wheeling fire. He saw a great juggernaut of stars form in the sky and threaten to roll over and crush him. He floated on his back when the valise filled and sank. The river was mild and leisurely, going away from the people who ate shadows for breakfast and steam for lunch and vapors for supper. The river was very real. It held him comfortably and gave him the time, at last, the leisure, to consider this month, this year, a lifetime of years. He listened to his heart slow. His thoughts stopped rushing with his blood. He saw the moon low in the sky now, the moon there, and the light of the moon caused by what? By the sun, of course. And what lights the sun? Its own fire. And the sun goes on, day after day, burning and burning. The sun and time, burning, burning. The river bobbled him along gently, burning. The sun and every clock on the earth, it all came together and became a single thing in his mind. And after a long time of floating on the land and a short time of floating on the river, he knew why he must never burn again in his life. The sun burned every day. It burned time. The world rushed in a circle and turned on its axis, and time was busy burning the years and the people anyway, without any help from him. So if he burned things with the firemen, and the sun burned time, that meant everything burned. One of them had to stop burning, and the sun wouldn't, certainly. So it looked as if it had to be Montag, and the people he had worked with until a few short hours ago. Someone had to do the saving and the keeping, one way or another, in books, in records, in people's heads, any way at all, so long as it was safe, free from moths, silverfish, rust and dry rot, and men with matches. The world was full of burning of all types and sizes. Now the guild of the Estabus Weaver must open shop very soon. Montag felt his heel bump land, touch pebbles and rocks, scrape sand. The river had moved him towards the shore. He looked in at the great black creature, without eyes or light, without shape, with only a size that went 1,000 miles without wanting to stop, with its grass hills and forests that were waiting for him. He hesitated to leave the comforting flow of the water. He expected the hound to be there. Suddenly the trees might blow under a great wind of helicopters. He stepped from the river. The land rushed at him a tidal wave. He was crushed by the darkness and the look of the country and a million odors on a wind that iced his body. He fell back under the breaking curve of darkness and sound and smell, his ears roaring. He whirled. The stars poured over his sight like flaming meteors. He longed to plunge in the river again and let it idle him safely on down somewhere. The dark land rising was like that day in his childhood, swimming, when from nowhere the largest wave in the history of remembering slammed him down in salt mud and green darkness, water burning mouth and nose, retching stomach, screaming, too much water, too much land. Montag was alone in the wilderness. He stood breathing, and the more he breathed the land in, the more he was filled up with all the details of the land. He was not empty. There was more than enough here to fill him. There would always be more than enough.
it is impossible to keep silent when you feel by instinct that you could help, if only. Hey, do you know the details? Exactly 3 days after the murder, in the morning, they were still fussing over Coke and Pastraya Cove, even though those two were able to account for their every step. The evidence was unmistakable. All of a sudden, the most unexpected fact was announced. A certain peasant named Dushkin, the keeper of a tavern opposite that same building, appears in the office and tells a whole long tale. A fellow comes running in 2 days ago, he says, just after 8 o'clock. You hear? The day and the hour. A painter who'd come to see me before during the day. His name is Mikolai, and he brings in this here box of gold earrings and asks for 2 rubles in exchange. When I asked him where he got them, he said he found them in the street. I didn't ask him any more about it, and I gave him a note, that is, a ruble, because I thought if he didn't get it from me, he'd get it from someone else. It's all the same, he'll drink it up, so it's better for it to be in my hands, safe find, fast find, as they say. And if something comes out about it, I can always turn it in. I know this here peasant Mikolai from his childhood, and although he's not a drunkard, he does drink. And I knew that he was working on that same house as the deceased, painting together with Dmitri. After he gets his rubles, he downs 2 glasses of vodka, gathers his change, and leaves. I haven't seen him since. The next morning, I hear that Alyona Ivanovna and Izaveta Ivanovna have been killed with an axe. We knew them, sir, and I began to worry about them earrings, because I knew the dead woman lent money for pledges. I went to that house and began asking questions about the murder, carefully and quietly. The first one I asked was, is Mikolai here? Dmitri told me that Mikolai had gone off on a spree. Come home drunk at dawn, stayed for about 10 minutes, and then left. He hadn't seen him since, and was finishing up the work alone. They were working on the 2nd floor, painting on the same staircase as the deceased. After hearing all this, I found out the rest I could about the murder, and then went home with the same worries. This morning at 8 o'clock, Mikolai comes in to see me. He sits down in the corner and stays quiet. Besides him in the tavern, there was only one stranger. A man I knew was asleep on the bench, and my 2 boys. Did you, I ask, see Dmitri? No, he says, I didn't. And he wasn't here? No, not in the last 2 days. Did you hear that such and such happened on the same day, on the same staircase as the deceased? No, he says, I did not. As I'm telling him all this, his eyes widen and he grows ghostly pale. I see him reach for his cap and begin to bolt, but I wanted to keep him here. Mikolai, won't you drink up? I moved slowly from behind the counter, but he's gone, just like that, ran out the door and down the street. That settled all of my doubts. He's the culprit, no doubt about it.
Good evening. Today I'm reciting When Hannibal Hamlin Got the Jonah, a story from Old Squire's Farm. In this story, there are 7 children who, with their grandparents out of the house, decide to play a game. This game consists of many delicious pies and 2 Jonahs, which are pies, but instead of filling, they have cayenne pepper. And they are identical to the rest. So if you get a Jonah by accident, you have to go under the table and be a footstool for the others for the rest of the luncheon. The children are about to play the game when a stranger appears at the door asking for their grandparents. And since their grandparents are not home, they decide to invite him to lunch. He was seated at Gramps' place at table, and after a brief flurry in the kitchen, the big platter full of fried pies was brought out. What Ellen and Theodora had done was carefully to pick out the 2 Jonahs and lay them aside. "Are these the fried pies?" he asked with the broadest of smiles. "They resemble huge donuts, but I remember now that my mother used to fry something like this when I was a boy at home over at Paris Hill, and my recollection is that they were very good." "Yes, the most of them are very good," said Addison by way of making conversation, "unless you happen to get the Jonah." "And what's the Jonah?" inquired our visitor. Amidst much laughter, this was explained to him, and also the penalty. Mr. Hamlin burst forth into a great shout of laughter, which led us to surmise that he enjoyed fun. "But we have taken the Jonahs out of these," Theodora made haste to reassure him. "What for?" he exclaimed. Why, because we have guests," stammered Doe, much confused. "And spoil the sport?" he cried. "Young lady, I want those Jonahs put back." "But they're awful Jonahs," pleaded Theodora. "Young lady, I want those Jonahs put back," he insisted. "I shall have to decline to lunch here unless those Jonahs are in their proper places." Very shamefaced, Ellen brought them in. "No hocus pocus now," he cried, and nothing would answer but that we should all turn our backs and close our eyes, while Kate put them amongst the others on the platter. The platter was then passed, and all chose one. All took a good deep mouthful, he cried, as he entered mirthfully into the spirit of the game. "All together now." We all bit, 8 bites at once. As it chanced, no one got the Jonah, and the 8 fried pies disappeared rapidly. "But these are good," he cried. "Mine was gooseberry." Then, turning to Doe, "How many times may a fellow try for a Jonah here?" "5 times, said Doe, not a little pleased with the praise. The platter was then passed again, and again no one got the bran and cayenne. But on the 3rd passing, I saw Kate start visibly when our visitor chose his pie. "All together now." We all bit, and at the first taste, he stopped short, rolled his eyes around, and shook his head in his capacious mouth full. "Oh, but you need not eat it, sir," said Theodora, rushing around to help him. But without a word, our bulky visitor had sunk slowly out of his chair, and pushing it back, disappeared under the long table. For a moment we sat, scandalized, then shouted in spite of ourselves. In the midst of our confused hilarity, the table began to oscillate. It rose slowly several inches, then moved off, rattling, toward the sitting room door. Our jolly visitor had it on his hands and knees, and was crawling ponderously but carefully away with it, while the rest of us got ourselves and our chairs out of the way. In fact, the rest of the luncheon was a perfect gale of laughter. The big table walked clean around the room, and came back very carefully to its original position. After our hilarity had subsided, the girls served some very large, nice, sweet blackberries, which our visitor appeared to relish greatly. He told us of his boyhood over at Paris Hill, and of his fishing for trout in the streams thereabouts, and of the time he broke his arm, and of the doctor who set it so unskillfully that it had to be broken again and reset, and of the time that he was at his school, Hebron Academy, all with such relish that for an hour we were rapt listeners. When at length he declared he positively must be going on his way, we begged him to stay overnight, and brought his horse out with great reluctance. Before getting into the buggy, he took each of us by the hand, and saluted the girls. "I've had a good time," he said, "and it pleases me to see you here at this old farm in my native state. But it pains me more than I can tell you to know the sad reason of your coming here. You have my heartiest sympathy. Tell your grandparents I should have really liked to see them, he added, as he got into the buggy. And he took the reins from Addison. But sir, cried Theodora, earnestly, for we were all crowding up to the buggy at that time. Grandfather will want to know who it was who called. Well, you can describe me to him, said Mr. Hamlin. And if he can still not make me out, tell him it was a fellow he once knew, by the name of Hamlin. Goodbye. And with that, he rode off. The name signified little to us at the time. Well, whoever he is, he's an old brick, said House. I think he's just splendid, said Kate, enthusiastically. I think he has a nice, kind heart, said Theodora. When Gramp and Gram got home, we were not slow in telling them of the old man who had come to visit them and who had stayed for lunch with us. And his name was Hamlin. Hamlin, Hamlin, repeated the old squire absently. What sort of looking fellow? Ellen and Theodora described him with much zest. Why, Joseph, it must have been Hannibal. Why, so it was, said the old squire, laughing. Too bad we were not home. Not Hannibal Hamlin, the Vice President of the United States, Addison almost shouted. About that time, it would have taken nothing more than a turkey's feather to bowl us all over. Addison looked to Dode, Dode looked to Ellen looked to Kate, and Kate looked to me. House just whistled. What did you say or do that makes you look so queer? Said Graham with unease. I hope you treated him well. Oh, we didn't do nothing much, said Ellen, with a halting speech, except that he got the Jonah, and we've had the Vice President of the United States under the table to put our feet on. At this, Graham grew very red, and demanded that a letter be sent that night to apologize for us. But the old squire just laughed and said, I've known Hamlin since he was a boy. He enjoyed the pie as well as any of them. No apology is needed. Thank you.
If, by Rudyard Kipling. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the words you've spoken twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it all on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they're gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, if you can or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth distance run, yours is the world and everything in it. And, what is more, you'll be a man, my son.
God with Us by Folk Angel.
The people had read of this rescue that was coming through the bloodline of Abraham. And they had seen where Micah proclaimed about a ruler to be born in Bethlehem. Daniel prophesied about the restoration of Jerusalem. Isaiah's cry about the Son of God coming to them. So for them, it was anticipation. This groaning was growing generation after generation, knowing that he was holy no matter what the situation, but they longed for him. They yearned for him. They waited for him on the edge of their seats. On the edge of where excitement and containment meet, they waited. Like a child watches out the window for their father to return from work, they waited. Like a groom stares at the double doors at the back of the church, they waited. And in their waiting, they had hope. Hope that was fully pledged to a God they had not seen, to a God who would promise a king who would reign over the enemy, over Satan's tyranny. They waited. And so, it was centuries of expectations with various combinations of differing schools of thought. Some people were expecting a political king who would rise to the throne through the wars that he fought, while others were expecting a priest who would restore peace through the penetration of the Pharisees' facade, yet a baby. 100% human, 100% God. And so, the Word became flesh and was here to dwell among us in his fullness, grace upon grace, Jesus. You see, through him and for him, all things were created, and in him all things are sustained. God had made himself known for the glory of his name, and this child would one day rise as king. But it would not be by the sword or by an insurgent regime, it would be by his life. A life that would revolutionize everything the world knew. He'd endure temptation and persecution, all while staying true, humbly healing the broken, the sick, and hurting too, ministering reconciliation, turning the old to new. A life that would be the very definition of what life really costs, saying that if you desire life, then your current one must be lost. And he'd portray that with his own life as his Father would pour out and exhaust, and he would be obedient to the point of death, even death upon a cross. And so just 33 years after the day that he lay swaddled in the hay, he hung on a tree, suffocating, dying in our place, absorbing wrath that is rightly ours, but we can never bear the weight. So he took that punishment, put it in the grave, and he died. And when I say that he died, what I mean is that he died. No breath, no heartbeat, no sign of life. You see, God is a God of justice, and the penalty for our sin equals death. That's what Christ did on that cross. And then, just 3 days later, in accordance with the scriptures, he was raised from the grave. And when I say that he was raised, what I mean is that he was raised, lungs breathing, heart pumping, blood pulsing through his veins. The things that he promised were true. He is the risen Son of God, offering life to me and you, turning our mourning into dancing, our weeping into laughing, our sadness into joy. By his mercy we are called his own. By his grace we will never be left alone. By his love he's preparing our home, and by his blood we can sing before his throne. Now we, as his bride, are the ones waiting. Like the saints who came before, we're anticipating. He has shown us that this world is fading and has caused our desire to be for him. So church, stay ready. Keep your heart focused and your eyes steady. Worship him freely, never forgetting his great love for you. Emmanuel, God with us.
My king was born king. The Bible says my king is a seven-way king. He's the king of the Jews. That's a racial king. He's the king of Israel. That's a national king. He's the king of righteousness. He's the king of the ages. He's the king of heaven. He's the king of glory. He's the king of kings. and he's the Lord of lords. David said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." My king is a sovereign king. No means of measure can define his limitless love. No far-seeing telescope can bring into visibility the coastline of his shoreless supplies. No barrier can hinder him from pouring out his blessings. Well, he's enduringly strong, he's entirely sincere, he's eternally steadfast. He is immortally merciful, imperially powerful, impartially graceful. He's God's Son. He's the sinner's Savior. He's the centerpiece of civilization. He stands alone in himself. He's awesome. He's unique. He's unparalleled. He's unprecedented. He's supreme. He's preeminent. He's the loftiest idea in literature. He's the highest personality in philosophy. He's the supreme problem in higher criticism. He's the fundamental doctrine of true theology. He's the core and necessity of spiritual religion. He's the miracle of the age. He's the superlative of everything good that you choose to call him. He is the only one able to supply all of our needs simultaneously. He supplies strength for the weak. He's available for the tempted and the tried. He's our guard and he guides. He heals the sick. He cleanses the lepers. He forgives sinners. He discharges debtors, delivers the captive, defends the feeble. He blesses the young. He serves the unfortunate. He regards the aged. He rewards the diligent, and he beautifies the meek. Well, my king, he is the key to knowledge. He's the wellspring of wisdom. He's the doorway of deliverance. He's the pathway of peace. He's the roadway of righteousness. He's the highway of holiness. He's the gateway of glory. He's the captain of the conquerors. He's the master of the mighty. He's the leader of the legislators. He's the overseer of the overcomers. He's the governor of governors. He's the king of kings. And he's the Lord of lords. His office is manifold. His promise is sure. His life is matchless. His goodness is limitless. His love never changes. His word is enough. His grace is sufficient. His reign is righteous. His yoke is easy, and his burden is light. Well, I wish I could describe him to you, but he's indescribable. He's incomprehensible. He's irresistible. I've come to tell you that the heaven of heavens cannot contain him, let alone man explain him. You can't get him out of your mind. You can't get him out of your head. You can't outlive him, and you can't live without him. Well, the Pharisees, they couldn't stand him, but they also found they couldn't stop him. Pilate couldn't find any fault in him. The witnesses couldn't get their testimonies to agree. Herod couldn't kill him, death couldn't handle him, and the grave could not hold him. He always has been and always will be. I'm talking about he has no predecessor and he'll have no successor. There wasn't anybody before him and there'll be nobody after him. You can't impeach him because he's not going to resign. That's my king. Do you know him? Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen?
You can turn the house lights on, Braden. I don't just need the spotlight. Thank you. Another round of applause, please. On behalf of the 9th and 11th graders, as well as their teachers, I would like to extend my sincerest thanks to each and every one of you for gracing us with your presence this evening. Your attendance has added a special aura of warmth and appreciation to this evening's proceedings, and we are deeply grateful for your support. We hope that the poetry and classical speeches have left an indelible impression on your hearts and minds, and we look forward to welcoming you back to future events. Have a good evening.